Before we get out of image, we would be remiss on the Cartoonist Kayfabe channel if we didn't mention the first 6 issues of Sam and Twitch. Scott, tell us a Todd McFarlane story, man.
Thanks for having me. Jeez, man.
I think about the very first dinner I ever had with professionals. It was with you and Mahfood down at
Professionals.
Heroes Con. Well, you know what? Professionals that I looked up to, whose comics I read in high school. You old motherfucker. And you dropped some science on me that stuck with me from that day forward. One of the things you said was that you're a proponent of the Scorsese philosophy: one for me, one for you. Yeah, you'll do jobs, you do work for hire.
Yep.
But then you always have your thing that you could be passionate about and look forward to and all that, and I carried that with me forever. So in this conversation, I think this will be illustrated very clearly. Where do we begin? CalArts?
Yeah, let's start there.
Man, I got into CalArts probably before I should have got into CalArts. I was right out of high school. I was 18. I actually got rejected. I had found out about it from my art teacher, my high school art teacher. I had one backup school, San Jose State, and I got into San Jose State, but I didn't get into CalArts, and I was all bummed. So my dad wasn't going to hear it, so we fought our way in there, and I found the dean of the school was not the dean of the animation program. It was 2 different people. So I got a hold of Glenn Vilppu, the guy that he was life drawing master back in the day. Got a hold of him, and he said, "Wait, what? What's your name again? Let me go find your portfolio." And the portfolio was still down there, and he looked through it. He's like, "Oh, no, you're in." And it was like one phone call, and it was like, my life could have changed on one phone call and one flippant, you're in. So then I got in.
That's kind of an unbelievable story. I mean, how many people get their rejection letter and that's it? That's the end of their dreams for that school.
And that's the thing. It's
one phone call.
Yeah, and I guess that was my first don't give up kind of thing. So that's where I kind of learned you can fight your way into things.
What kind of prep goes into that? Because I always think of you as being a guy who draws circles around there's different levels of drawers in comics. One of my first memories of you is at Mocha. I was sitting next to you at the table, and you were doing drawings for people, and it looked like it was coming out of an inkjet printer or something, where you were just starting at the top and drawing these amazing drawings. And I mean, it distinguished you from everybody I was looking around and had been tabling with and seeing. So, when you're applying for CalArts, you must have a strong background coming from somewhere.
I didn't. My strong background was from copying comics. From copying Garfield, in 2nd, 3rd grade, and then I discovered G.I. Joe, and I was copying those, and then from there I discovered, Frank Miller's Daredevil run, and that kind of was my big push into comics at the time. So 3rd, 4th grade I started reading comics, and it was really just on me being an introverted kid that acted extroverted. I had a lot of friends and things, but I was the one kid that could draw in the school that I showed up in. I mean, there were other kids that could draw too. But I was diligent about coming home from school and drawing all day long. And I would draw. And my parents we came from a family. My grandpa and my dad were both Ford mechanics. My mom took care of us at home, worked in the school district. Nobody could draw. My grandpa, because they were mechanics, my grandpa did a lot of wood carving and things. He was Hawaiian. I'm this much Hawaiian. My dad can think visually. He writes poems and things. But I guess I came from this background of them letting me do it, giving me the time to do it, and thinking visually and kind of figuring things out on my own. So I would sit and draw and copy these things, and I had no bearing to know if they were good or not, other than me being a plagiarist as a 10-year-old, 12-year-old. And then I hit middle school, and I started forget it, I'm going to start drawing my own comics. So I started making up my own comics, just like everybody does, and kind of went from there. And then in high school, my high school art teacher was a really great draftsman, and in hindsight, better than the community knew to give him credit for. This guy Glenn Ballantyne, his daughter actually went to CalArts as well. The same time I was there, she was older than me, but she worked for Walt Disney Imagineering and a bunch of other places. But he was the one that found out about CalArts and kind of pushed me to go that direction. I didn't know what I was doing other than that. I was just drawing things I liked. And looking back on it, it's a fanzine stuff, and even the first stuff, the very first Soulwind version of Soulwind was in high school, and I was talking with Chris Pitzer about it earlier. I found out about this fanzine out of Ohio, and I'd never been to Ohio. That was being run by a girl that I had never met. I don't even remember where I heard of the fanzine, called Graphic Enterprises Presents. So I just started sending her artwork, and I'm like, will you print my comic? And she's like, sure, you got 2 pages an issue or whatever. And it ran for 3 issues or something and then died. But later, after I got into CalArts and started looking at indie comics coming out, because right when I started doing animation, that's when I got out of the house and got exposure to more comic shops and other friends that could draw. So they started showing me Love and Rockets. They started showing me other underground stuff. And I would go to conventions like in high school and things, and I'll tell you about that too. But I looked back at those like cringing, like I'm never going to show anybody these things. But I realized there's this kid, Paul Pope, in the same fanzine, and he did this comic called The Great Man that was THB. So when I finally met Paul a couple years later in 94, 95, I'm like, do you remember, like I think I brought one with me to San Diego or somewhere. I'm like, do you remember this? And he's like, oh my God. So we laugh now that like our first published work was in this fanzine, and we didn't know each other. And I guess he knew her because he was in Ohio or somewhere, but.
That's a hell of a fanzine. Like, that's a pretty good pedigree.
I'll find him and scan it and send it to you guys. But it's, yeah.
And CalArts has a reputation at that time, and I guess still has a reputation as being this great animation.
It's the Disney
yeah.
camp.
Yeah, it actually was kind of the second generation of a school called Chenard that was big in I think Chenard was probably started in the 20s or 30s. Everybody in animation's probably slapping me right now through the internet, because I don't know my Chenard history. But my mentor, Maurice Noble, went there with Mary Blair and a bunch of other animation big shots. And then Chenard fell apart, and eventually I think Roy Disney and some other people injected money into CalArts and built up CalArts. But yeah, I think it's appreciated as kind of a more important animation school because the instructors there historically work in the industry, because it's near the industry down there in LA. So you'll get teachers that are working at Disney or are working at now DreamWorks or all these other places, and they teach at night because they love it and they want to keep injecting back into the art form. So you were getting the real deal when you got down there. It wasn't instructors who had maybe heard about animation or like they had learned it but had never really done it, or maybe had tried it. It was, yeah. So the school is actually working pros, teaching future working pros. So my learning jumped exponentially. I mean, again, I got in there when I was 18, and most people get to art school, I realized later, when they're 22. They've been to another 4-year, or they've been to a community college. So I was way too stupid and naive to even be at an art school yet, exposed to that stuff. But I was super ambitious and worked my butt off and was brazen and left my sophomore year. So I'm a dropout. I was working for Chuck Jones my sophomore year because I stuck my finger in it and introduced myself to Chuck and introduced myself to Maurice when they came and gave a talk, and other instructors were very supportive, and it was a good time in the industry too. Lion King was just about to come out, Aladdin had just come out, DreamWorks hadn't even started yet, they were just about to drop, and there was a lot going on. There were a lot of jobs to be had.
Was that fairly common that, I don't know, the best in your class would leave early, or they'd be getting recruited?
I wasn't even the best in my class. I mean, there were incredible people. I think it was just, I was the dummy with the moxie to speak up and not know enough to shut up. And
go start working.
And then I started working.
Doing some research and seeing the Chuck Jones thing jumped out at me because I didn't realize he was in the game even in the 90s. And then it made me think about, there's sort of like the legendary, what do they call them, like the wise old men?
Oh, the 9 old men,
and
yeah.
Were any of those guys even around?
They were around. Frank and Ollie were still around. They actually lived down the block from Maurice Noble, the guy that I trained under, in La Crescenta, outside of Pasadena in LA. And a few of those guys were still alive in various places. I think one of them lived up near San Francisco.
But they never passed through the school while you were there?
They didn't. A lot of them became, not reclusive, but they weren't working, so they were retired old men. I mean, even Chuck, at his studio, would lock himself in his room, and you rarely saw him, if ever. But I'd get a bunch of layout drawings from him when I was working with Maurice, and I'm having to put registration, and it's grunt work, at the time, but as I was kind of first cutting my teeth assisting Maurice when he was laying out a Roadrunner cartoon in like 93 or something. They were going to try to start doing theatrical Looney Tunes again at the time. And they did one called Chariots of Fur. So I was helping Maurice with the layout on that. And I'm drawing on original Chuck Jones drawings as like a 19-year-old, 20-year-old. Like, what am I doing? I don't know. I'm marring these drawings with red red pen or whatever that I was using at the time. But that's what they asked me to do. And then, but I was working with Maurice, and Maurice was the flip side of Chuck. They were both in their late 80s, and Maurice acted like he was 20. And you'd bring him paintings, like, because I was designing a few of the future shorts that never happened at the same time, and I was learning from Maurice. And my theory was, I'm going to leave school and get paid to learn, or I can stay in school and keep paying to learn from the same people for 2 more years. And my sister was getting ready to go to college, and my grandma had fronted all the money for CalArts, and we came from a blue-collar working class family. My grandma would give her left arm for us to succeed. So I decided I'm going to leave, I'm going to start getting paid, I'm going to pay for my sister to go to San Jose State to be a teacher. So that all worked out. But I was working with Maurice, and you'd bring him artwork, and he'd look at it for about, we'd talk about it for about 10 minutes, and he'd school you and tell you how to fix things or praise you on a couple things, and he'd be like, let's go get a sandwich. What are we doing up here? Let's go downstairs to the lot and get it. So we'd walk out of the Warner Brothers lot that was right there, and we'd, actors from Friends were walking by, or whatever was happening at the time. I think Mel Gibson almost hit us on his bike because he was filming Maverick. Didn't see us. But so I'm walking around with this like 88, 89-year-old acting like he's 20 and just wanting to gab about like what's going on. And I'm trying to talk to him about comics. He's like, I was never really into that. I knew Walt Kelly. I was on the... And it's like, what? And so then all the stories would start coming out. It's like, who else did you know? It's like, did you know Bill Titla? Did you know like so-and-so? He's like, oh yeah, And so you'd hear all these stories about all these old animation people, but also old strip artists and things that worked at Disney at the time. So I was starting to get a little bit of my history through him. But he was on the Frank Capra film unit in World War II with Ted Geisel, Dr. Seuss, Chuck, and Walt Kelly. I mean, this was like they were doing all the Private Snafu shorts and all that stuff, like propaganda stuff that you can see now in the 5 Came Back documentaries and all that kind of thing. But it was great to hear all these stories, and he'd talk about like, oh yeah, Walt was great, and he's like, those are the kind of the comics that I knew. So when I did Soulwind, I gave it to him. He's like, oh, this is great, sign it to me. He's like, I wish we could show it to Walt, and so we'd talk about that stuff. But
thinking about the animation piece of your early career, it makes a lot of sense, especially if a fan sees you at a convention and sees that you have like 5 sketches going at once, with the paintbrush going, okay, like I'll put all orange down with these 5 sketches. It's a very, very fast process that you've developed over time.
So that's actually a stolen technique from Maurice, and Maurice didn't even work that way when he worked with Ivan Durrell. Back in the day, before Ivan did, I think they were working on Bambi or something at the time. He said Ivan, if you went over to Ivan's house and he was working on 3 paintings, like 3 landscapes or something, that's how he would work. He would have 3 of them up at a time, and he'd go through and do all the green. He'd go through and do all the like major shapes, and then he'd come back and do a layer of new shapes. And it was kind of this factory system. And he would bag on Ivan a little bit for it, but it occurred to me like, that's actually kind of a genius way to work. Like, they don't all have to be the same thing, but I can work on different things in the same style and in the same color scheme, same patterns and same brushes and stuff that I'm using. And just, if 2 of them don't work out, one out of the 3 will look good, right? So it gave me it's almost like making prints, I guess, in that way, where it's like if you're pulling screen prints or something, like, oh, that one didn't work out. It's like, but it's with original. I mean, not that screen prints aren't originals, but there you go. So I stole that from stories from Maurice.
Always fascinating to watch you do that. Head is always down at the festivals, man, and you see the brushes flowing. Would you work on your comic pages that way? Like what? I'm just kind of skipping ahead, and we'll just touch on this for a second. But like, I'm thinking of the Kurosawa comic or something.
Sure.
It would be the same color palette throughout, and
sometimes if they were similar pieces or similar, I'll almost think of them like sequences in a film. So this is kind of the crossover, I guess, and kind of the thinking pattern. Even when I'm doing comics now, like with Dugout, the new book that I just did, I'll think of things almost like scenes in a movie. And comics and movies are 2 totally different things, even though people like to look at them as, oh, you did a comic, so you've already done the storyboards. And it's like, that's not storyboards. It's different language. Film language is different than comics language in a few key ways. But I will think, as I'm writing, this is a moment in the story that all takes place in one set piece, it all takes place in one area. I'll execute those 10 pages, and I'll get that chunk done, and I won't work on it for a month, and then I'll do the next scene, right? And so I'll think about it in scenes. So it's similar thinking, I think, to that I try to pull over into how I'm executing work. I think when I'm working on like Barefoot Serpent, when I was doing paintings, it would be a little bit more like the Ivan Durrell thing, where I would do 3 or 4 that were from the same thought pattern of the story, and so the art direction of the colors and things would be similar. So it made sense to keep the paint wet and kind of do that section at once. So I'll think about it in terms of the creative need, as opposed to just cranking out work. I'll think about like, well, this is one thought. I got to get that thought done, and then I can move on to the next thought, and kind of separate myself from it.
Chuck Jones happens. I'm assuming that goes on for a little while. Where does Soulwind is the first image?
So I was working on Soulwind at the same time.
Okay, that's sort of what I wanted to hear.
And that came from Maurice as well. So when I was at CalArts, I actually did the first pages for Soulwind, right as I started working for Chuck, probably. And it came from a couple of places. It came from having seen Bone starting to come out. And then I just started picking up Cerebus, and I was getting exposed to a lot of that stuff. And I'm like, you know what? I have a job in animation now, so I can pay for my hobby. I'm going to do comics on the side, and I'm going to have my own thing. And then Maurice he validated that by saying, look, I've worked with and for Disney and Chuck and a bunch of other places my whole life. Have something of your own on the side, because he's like, your work, your voice is important too, and you should be able to stand or fall on your own merits too, and that you're going to learn some stuff that way, where a more direct fan base is going to be less forgiving, so you'll know if you're doing well, rather than working with a bigger team. And film and animation is a team effort, and comics can be a team effort, but you can also, I mean, you guys know, you can pare it down to one person can do all of it. So there's a little bit of the like get out that ego thing through the comics. So I would probably drive myself insane and slit my wrists if I didn't have a book going on or something going on the side, as well as my film work. And Pixar's been very forgiving of letting everybody they've been very good about protecting people's intellectual property that they own, as long as you're up front with them and clear about it. So I try to perpetuate that and keep it going. But Soulwind I was doing at the exact same time as starting to work with Chuck's. And then I got through those first 4 issues, probably the first year or 2 in my working in animation. So yeah, they were happening I would go home at night and draw. And all my other buddies were, we were all fresh out of college, and they were all partying, they were all going and doing their thing. I'd go home and watch my Criterion Laserdiscs and draw my Soulwind.
We were talking about you on the way up here, trying to get a chronology for the career. And Jim is an OG, so he knew your work from Soulwind, but my first Scott Morse comic was from C.S. Morse, I think, Little Gray Men.
Uh-huh.
How quick does that see the light of day after Soulwind?
The same time as Soulwind. So Soulwind,
I love it, man. You're
and Little Gray Man started as a joke. So when I worked at Chuck's, and I was probably at Chuck's for like a year, and then Turner Feature Animation started up. And Turner, they did 2 films that maybe people have heard of, maybe they haven't, Page Master and Cats Don't Dance. And they were developing a bunch of other films. So they hired me into development in '94. And I left Chuck's to go there because they were going to pay me more. And that was kind of my first real big boy job, like all day long, because Chuck's I was really just doing freelance. And Maurice found out about it and was like, what do they pay you over there? Do you think they'd hire me? So Maurice actually followed me over to Turner Feature Animation. This was Ted Turner's company. That eventually folded and became into Warner Brothers when Warner's bought Turner. And the film that came out of all that stuff was Iron Giant. So, Quest for Camelot was in there somewhere, right before Iron Giant. But I was working with the crew that would become the Iron Giant crew. So Brad Bird and all those guys were at Turner as well. And I was sharing an office with my buddy Ricky Nierva and another friend Jenny LaRue and another buddy Mike Stern, who were all animation folks. And we would just do comics for fun on the side. There was a comic shop downstairs, so we would go downstairs and buy like Stray Bullets #1 and just come out, like all these things. And I'm working on Soulwind at the same time, and I haven't published anything at this point. But I would get the 11 by 17 paper out of the printer at work, and we'd finish our stuff at work, and I'd start drawing Little Gray Man at work. And I think El Mariachi had just come out, and like a bunch of like indie film stuff was coming out at the same time too. So like Tarantino's stuff was just starting to drop. So Little Gray Man was sort of a response to that. Like I was kind of making fun of that, and I was super into like Alien, Roswell, fun. I like to believe in the fantasy.
What a nexus of like creative energy happening that you've just described. I feel like we can go down any of these avenues.
Yeah.
Like Iron Giant, Brad Bird. Did you get a sense of like this is special? This is like some upper echelon type of creators.
Yeah, I didn't work on Iron Giant. We were working on a film called Ray Gun at the time, and when they hired Brad in, he actually had the rights to The Spirit too. So we were like, "We're gonna do The Spirit," and he's like, "Hey, I don't know, I don't want to do The Spirit. Like, I got this other thing, Ray Gun, that I want to do." So we were doing development on Ray Gun and in addition to like 10 other projects that never saw the light of day. But that crew, like meeting all those guys, like the Ren and Stimpy crew was there, like at post Ren and Stimpy. They actually ended up, so Lynn Naylor and Chris Riccardi, Don Shank, all these guys that worked on Ren and Stimpy were there. And then Lynn and Chris stopped coming in one day. And Lynn was associated with John Kay for a long time, and then they had split up, and Lynn and Chris got married. They just stopped coming in for like 2 weeks, and everybody was like, "Where are Lynn and Chris?" And then I get a phone call one day, and it's Lynn on the phone, whispering into the phone like somebody's listening. She's like, "Hey, it's Lynn." I'm like, Where'd you guys go? What's going on?" She's like, "We're at Universal doing a Hercules and Xena movie, like an animated movie. Will you come art direct it?" I'm 21, I think, 22 maybe. And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" She's like, "I just like your paintings. You should come art direct it." I'm like, "You're okay, let me come talk to you." So I went over and talked to them, and they like doubled my salary, and like, so I art directed this movie. But that was how we like, you just kind of knew people and you jumped around a little bit. So there was this creative nexus of networking happening in animation, very similar to comics. I started finding out when I started doing the comic stuff. So it was nuts. But Little Gray Man was happening simultaneously. So actually, when I finally met Valentino and did Soulwind, he was like, "What else?" And I had a photocopied like 100 pages of Little Gray Man at an ape convention, right? And I think Soulwind was at the printer or something, and Jim came by the table to talk, and he looked down and he's like, "What is this now?" He's like, we're doing Soulwind, but where did this come from?" I'm like, "Oh, I'm just doing this too." He's like, "Well, let's print that too." I'm like, "Yeah, but it's not really an image comic. It's a different size. I want to do it like a manga size." He's like, "Cool." So Little Gray Man came out because Jim had seen it sitting on the table with Soulwind. He's like, "Let's just do all of it."
That's one of the things that popped out at me was the kind of odd size, and I'm a little hazy about that time, and I wonder.
So am I.
Like, do you have any sense of other image comics that were sort of like in the same space as you? Because to me, like Little Gray Man was the first image comic that I saw that wasn't hyper masculine kind of what we think of like old school image.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean that first big shift with Valentino's Shadow line, he got a hold of me. I'll back up a little bit because, as you can tell, I'm long-winded, so I'll try to trace the history of it. So I was doing Soulwind on my own, and I had intended on self-publishing it, and Image was coming out, and I think Valiant was coming out, and I kind of viewed them as similar, like Archer and Armstrong, and so I was collecting all that stuff, and I was like, I love all this stuff, but I also like this Bone thing, and I'm coming from animation, and I like Alex Raymond, and like I kind of want to do all these. I want to do something different, something a little more traditional, sci-fi, right? So I was working on Soulwind, and I was just going to self-publish it. I'm like, I'm just going to do it black and white. This guy Jeff Smith's doing it. Paul Pope's starting to do it. Obviously Cerebus was doing it. Like, I'm looking at all these guys that I'm starting to fall in love with all the black and white stuff. I'm like, I can do this myself. I have my job. I can print it myself. So no big deal. But I was savvy enough, I guess, to realize like nobody knows who I am. So I should just go to a convention and set up and just start drawing. So I set up at WonderCon in Oakland. And I used to skip school in high school to go to WonderCon. So I had met some pros. I had met Matt Wagner and Mike Allred, and I'd gone up to Bob Schreck and Diana Schutz in high school and made a lot of friends. Mignola, like I knew them kind of peripherally. That was that kid that kept showing up at their table, and I'd show them my portfolio when I was in high school, and they'd be like, "Someday."
It's an interesting list of names you just pull out, because like I think of your style as being different than a lot of the house styles, but every artist you just named sort of fits that. Like it's all those guys that had a very distinct style to themselves, and one that was a little bit outside of that house style tradition. Yeah,
and I think I got associated with that in my brain because I associated Dark Horse, and even before that, Slave Labor Graphics in San Jose was near me, and I would bug Dan Vado. He used to throw a convention called Americon that became Ape at a certain point. So I I knew that indie comics exist and that you could print them and that it's something you could do on your own. So I had even printed one. Like the local comic shop there was a kid that worked there who was a senior at like Santa Clara University. He wanted to be a writer, so he's like, let's do a comic. So we did one issue of a book called Ancient Siege that came out, and like we printed it ourselves. We didn't promote it, and I realized this didn't sound like nobody knew this existed. Because we didn't follow through on it. And it was very wannabe image, hyper masculine, like what you're talking about. But it was kind of a space adventure. And there's copies of it floating around somewhere. And it looks like high school art. I drew it, I think, my senior year or freshman year at CalArts. And it didn't sell because we realized we didn't promote it. Like, I'm going to have to promote this stuff. So it occurred to me, set up at a convention, and I'd been to WonderCon, so I'm just going to get a table. I can afford a table at WonderCon, so I'm going to sit there. So I bought a table at WonderCon, and I'm sitting next to Bruce Timm, who knew the people I was working with at Universal at the time, so I was able to talk to him about that. And I didn't really know, I knew prose as I would walk around. And I just sat there, and my dad had built me some stand-ups to put big printouts of my art on. So I had pages from Soulwind up. There was nothing existed. And I had a photocopied copy for people to look through. I'm like, it's going to come out, but I don't know when. Let me do a free drawing for you. And I had like, a brush and all that kind of stuff. And I was doing stuff. And I'd also, in addition, the year before I had gone to my first San Diego Comic-Con. And I had walked up to Alan Spiegel's booth. And I met Jay Muth. And Jay was doing these big brush paintings. And he invited me behind the table, and we started drawing together. He had looked at my portfolio. He's like, yeah, let's do some drawings together. So he had given me a brush. He told me where to get brushes. And I'm like, I'm going to do part of Soulwind in that style. So the bookends for Soulwind are kind of in that brush painting style. So I'd learned that from Jay. So I was doing those brush paintings, and I had this big brush out. And I'm just giving away paintings to people. And so a crowd was starting to form because they were free. Yeah. And I'm giving away artwork. And it didn't occur to me to charge people because I wasn't anybody who would pay a nobody for their artwork. But I saw Shrek at that convention, and he was just about to leave and start Oni. They were in talks for that a couple years early, but he's like, let's talk. Let's keep talking. I'm like, okay. So he'd given me his card. I keep drawing. And then Valentino came up to the table, and he's like, hey, I'm Jim Valentino. I'm like, holy crap, I know who you are. And we talked for a bit, and he's like, I want to do this thing at Image that's black and white comics and things. You don't have a publisher? Like, I think I want to do this at Image. I can do it. Like, each of the partners at Image can do what we want to do, and this is what I want to do. I want to get back to alternative comics, and I want to do some black and white stuff. And this looks great. I want this to be one of the first books. I'm like, cool, let's keep talking. Like, I don't know how this fits at Image. It doesn't look like Image stuff. I think that, I got to think about that. That feels weird. He's like, well, let's talk about it. He left. Then Rob Liefeld came up to the table, and I had never met Rob either, but he had seen me doing drawings as well, and he's like, what is this little gray man thing? What is it? Like, we got to talk, man. Like, I'm like, Jim Valentino just came over here. He's like, oh, cool. Okay, well, one of us is going to end up doing this. And I'm like, okay, that's weird. And then I'm drawing, and there's a couple of people standing around, and I hear this old woman talking to her husband, going, you have a brush like that at home, right? And he's like, shh, stop talking. And I'm like, I stop drawing, and I look up, and I'm like, that's Will Eisner. And Will Eisner had stopped by the table. He was a guest at the show, and he's watching me, and I'm like, I drop everywhere. I'm like, Mr. Eisner, that's how I met Will Eisner. And I had only met him once or twice, but we started talking. He's like, I like what you're doing with that. And he was super complimentary. And he had come, and I was like, wow, okay, that's validation. I got to do something with this. But I showed him my portfolio. He's like, if I had a studio, if I was doing children's books or something, I'd hire you. I'm like, wow, that's amazing. So I felt really good coming out of this convention where I made no money, spent a lot of money, but had met some people. And then a couple weeks later, I got on the phone with Valentino, and we ended up trying to get Soulwind going. But he, through Shadowline, I'm like, you're doing Shadowhawk. Like, what do you want to do these other things for? He's like, well, actually, you're too young to know, but I was like one of the early, he's like, I think of myself as an underground guy because I was doing this book, Valentino, and he showed me a bunch of copies. I'm like, oh, this is great. He's like, yeah, I want to get back to that. I want to do this thing called Touch of Silver. I'm like, okay, cool. He's like, so I want to do Touch of Silver, I want to do Soulwind, and then there was this guy, Jimmy Robinson, who was doing a book called Amanda and Gunn, and another guy named Aaron Warner, who was a strip artist somewhere, but he wanted to collect all the strips into a comic and kind of turn it into a comic called The Adventures of Aaron. And I think those are the first 4 books. And then Little Gray Man came out after that, and Soulwind kind of kept coming out. And then Soulwind got nominated for Eisner's, which was a weird thing. And I think it's because I had met and had befriended a lot of people earlier, so I knew to give them books when Soulwind started coming out. So I just kind of knew who to give them to more than anything. But that was kind of the genesis of the weird shift into black and white comics at Image. And then I didn't live too far from where Valentino was at. because I was in Burbank at the time. So I would drive down to Shadowline, and we'd go out to lunch and we'd look at what other books were coming out, and I'd see what, all the comps that were coming in from Image, and just kind of started to get a feel for how the industry started to work, and numbers, like numbers coming back from Diamond and promotion. So he kind of was a real mentor and kind of cutting my teeth in just the business of it too.
With all that we've just talked about, we're now up to 1997.
Yeah.
What comes next, Scott? Oni?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oni came up, and because I knew Shrek and I was good buddies with all of them, and the stuff at Image was the numbers were starting to drop. I was learning the industry, right? The first sales for Soulwind were I think were like 17,000 or something like that. And then issue 2 was like 11,000. And then issue 3 was like 8,000. And issue 4 was like 6,000. And then issue 5 was like 3,000. So I saw that it was dropping off, and Jim was like, I don't know, we can keep this going. Like, there's a break-even point, and maybe we, So I started learning all that. But I started talking with Shrek as well, and they were starting Oni. And they didn't want to reprint what I was doing yet. I'd done another book called Visitations that had come out during that time too, and that was kind of one of the last things that I had done at Image, and that looked very un-Image. Like, I was starting to look at Drawn and Quarterly books and Fantagraphics book. Like, I was trying to design things to look like Dan Klaus, and I gave him a copy of one of those at WonderCon, of Visitations at WonderCon, and he was like, "Image did this?" It was one of those. He's like, "I don't know who you are, but this doesn't look like anything Image does." And I was like, "Well, you probably won't like it, but I love your stuff, thank you."
So you're still dividing your time between animation and comics.
I'm still doing both. But I started working for Oni, and that's where I fell in with Mahfoud and all those guys, and Troy Nixie. Sean Conant was a letterer at the time. Just an awesome crew of people, and I kind of found like a family in comics that felt like these are even more my people than like the Valentino crowd, because like I would see them peripherally, but that was more professional, it felt like, and this felt like I could, like, friends you can party with. So I'd go up to Portland, and we'd do shows up there, and we'd do Comic-Con and different places. We'd see each other all over the. I'd go visit Jim in Arizona. He was in Tempe at the time. So we just started cranking out more work, and it was like, let's do a book together. So Jim and I did Voodoo together for Oni, and we just started putting out all these different types of stories. And that was kind of the Oni of it. And I'd stopped doing stuff with Image and started doing stuff with Oni, and I kind of felt like, because my stuff wasn't the hyper-masculine stuff, maybe that's why it was falling away at Image. People maybe bought the first few issues of Soulwind thinking it was speculative, and they didn't know what it was, so they can make. Nobody ever made money on Soulwind, so it didn't go anywhere. But I felt like maybe this is a better family for me, like over here. So I started doing stuff with Oni, and then I fell in. That's how I met the Top Shelf guys, and I did Barefoot Serpent with Top Shelf. So I just started like trying out different places. I would talk to different places about a new book as I was working on them. But I did a bunch of different graphic novels through Oni at that point. And then they were like, well, let's, like Soulwind, there's kind of, like, what, you stopped at a certain point. I'm like, yeah, it's actually 5 volumes, and I really only got through 2 at Image. And they're like, well, let's finish it, but let's do it as graphic novels. Let's do 5 graphic novels. So then I finished Soulwind through there. And around that time, I got married as well. And I was art directing a show at Cartoon Network called Cow and Chicken. So I had the 2 jobs going on. And then I just, after that, I kind of got into like, I'm going to try to self-publish some stuff too. Why not? Like, I still feel like Jeff Smith like all these people would come up to me at conventions and be like, just do it yourself. Why do you need this? Like, it's more fun if you just do it yourself. And I'm like, okay. And we know how much fun that is to do all of it yourself. And that's like 80% of the job is marketing and business and stuff you don't learn in art school or film school. So I'm still testing the waters. I mean, even up to this day, it's like, who's the best place to be with? What's the best home for this particular story, I think, is where it comes out. And I think that's where the Image lesson really came to shine, was like, I don't typically draw or write in that style or those types of stories. So why am I trying to cram something into that machine? Like, they could put it out, but it's not the most effective home for it. So now I try to find the people I like working with the best, because if you don't like who you're with, then it's not worth doing. So that's the biggest lesson I've kind of learned, is like, just, if you're not having fun, don't do it.
Before we get out of Image, we would be remiss on the Cartoonist Kayfabe channel if we didn't mention the first 6 issues of Sam and Twitch. Scott, tell us a Tom McFarlane story, man.
So they had done Sam and Twitch. Bendis had done all that, and I knew Bendis like peripherally. And then Mark Andreyko was a buddy of mine from Burbank. We would go out to lunch all the time. The weirdest lunch group ever. Best lunch group. Me, Mark Andreyko, Jim Mahfood had moved to Burbank, or to, no, he was in Hollywood, I think. And Doug TenNapel would all show up and eat lunch together. So you have Doug TenNapel, who's very religious and on one side of the spectrum politically. Mark Andreyko, who is very liberal, not religious, also a gay man. Jim Mahfood and I, who would just kind of watch the ping pong match between like at lunch, and it was and we would all walk away friends at the end of it, and it was like a good lesson in like people can be completely different walks of life and can even be jerks or not jerks depending on your point of view and who's saying what to who, and everybody's got opinions, but at the end of the day we all love comics, we all draw comics, and that's the thing. But Mark had come up to me and was like, hey, we got to do something together. I'm going to do a Sam and Twitch thing, and I want you to draw it. And he's like, and I want to do it in three. He's like, I want to tell, it's like 3 acts of a story, but I want to tell all 3 acts at once. So the top panel is Act 1, the middle panel is Act 2, and the third panel is Act 3. So we're going to start, issue 1 has the beginning of each act, and we're going to track each act through over 6 issues. I'm like, I love the high concept, let's do it. And we'll draw them all a little differently. I'll paint one panel, and I'll just ink one panel, and I'll ink one panel with a brush and one panel with a pen. You know, like they'll feel a little different. So then this goes to Todd, who I'd never met at this point. And he knew me enough to know that, oh, Valentino printed your black and white books. Yeah, I didn't like those. Like, I don't know why we did any of that. Like, that's not what, like, I remember him saying something along those lines, and I'm probably misquoting the poor guy. So, Todd, if you're listening, I hope I represent my end of it correctly and don't offend your end of it. But he was super honest, and he was like, you know, I don't know your work. I don't really like your work. I don't know that this is going to work. It's not really Sam and Twitch. I don't know that I want this. I don't know. Let's try it. Let's send me some pages. And like, so we had a couple conversations on the phone, and Sam and Twitch kind of came out of that. And I still don't think he loved it, but I think it got over the hump of like, okay, this fits within the Spawn universe, at least how you're executing it. It's this, you know, inspired by Sienkiewicz kind of painted covers and like, you know, this crazy style. And it did well enough that I think they did some more Case File Sam and Twitch stuff after that. But that's the closest that I ever got to the Spawn universe or any of that. And I didn't even get to draw Spawn because Mark didn't write any of that stuff in there. I drew Patton Oswalt. He's in there as a character randomly in like a courtroom scene or something. But my interactions with Todd were pretty much just on the phone, and he was very blunt and very quick and very Todd, and didn't really have a lot of time, but had to have this conversation. And at the end of the day, he let it slide, I guess, to let some bonehead that he didn't really know draw his characters.
That's a really good summary. Like, when I think of your work, again, whenever I encountered it as part of this, but like, comics really changed from being very narrow to almost anything.
Yeah.
Visually. And I feel like you're right there when that's happening, because you do work at Marvel that seemed way outside of what Marvel would typically publish with Elektra. You're doing stuff at DC Comics. Catwoman.
And I did
way outside that normal, and you know, in this case with Spawn, Sam, and Twitch. And I wonder if you were conscious of that at the time.
Oh yeah. They knew, they were very conscious of it at the time, but the editors pushed that stuff through at the time. So at Marvel, it was actually through Marvel Knights. They pushed through the Elektra thing. Like, I was at Comic-Con, and they had approached me, and they were like, we should do something with Elektra. And at the time, the guy that was running Marvel, and I forget who it was.
Gemmis?
It might have been Gemmis.
Because I always associate like Quesada and Gemmis is whenever that started to sort of change and like.
Yeah, it was Marvel Knights. That was the Marvel Knights era. That's when Bendis came in and that whole crowd. So they approached me and they were like, you know, let's do something with Elektra. They really like Elektra right now. I'm like, great, but I don't want to fetishize her. So I put her in a trench coat throughout the whole story. And the other thing with Elektra was like, they're like, you know, they're pushing Elektra, and I'm like, Wolverine, Daredevil, can I do something like with some stakes? And they're like, Elektra. I'm like, Elektra's dead. Like, the whole thing with Elektra is she comes back to life. You can't kill her. How am I gonna? I can't get anybody to there's no stakes in that character. Like, so I had to wrap my head around like, okay, psychologically I can screw with her then. So I did this kind of high concept thing where she's at that time at Marvel, she was being hired as a hitman by different people to do jobs because she was an assassin. And so I'm like, well, what if she's hired by a ghost? She died, like, between lives, she's actually, like, propositioned by a ghost for a job to, like, figure out the murder or whatever. I'm like, so she can see dead people and, like, just for this one adventure. And, like, that kind of worked into bringing, you know, the hand back into it, and I wanted to draw ninjas and all that kind of stuff, but I threw basketball in there too. It was just this weird book, and Marvel didn't really know what to do with it, and it was fully painted in this like weird style, and Jemis is like, I don't see Greg Horn airbrush craziness on the cover here. I see some stylized cartoon thing. So it did its 4 issues or whatever it was, and kind of disappeared. They never collected it. I think it was collected overseas once. But around this time, Bob Schreck started working for DC. And I knew, again, I had known Bob for a really long time. He was like, hey, so we just did this thing where Jim Gordon got shot, and he's no longer, like, in Gotham City, and we want to bring him back into Gotham. He's, like, disappeared out of the books for this arc. Can you do a Jim Gordon story? And I'm like, yeah. He's like, do, like, an 80-page Jim Gordon story, and I would paint it and do whatever you want with it. And so I'm like, okay. So I went wilder than whatever I want with it, and it turned into this kind of like hyper-designed homage to Key Largo, right? Where Jim Gordon leaves Gotham City and ends up in Florida, and he's holed up in a hotel trying to be retired and trying to get Batman out of his system. But there's this kid who idolizes Batman and realizes the old commissioner from Gotham is there, and he must know Batman. And this little kid, and like, of course, they get stormed in, like in Key Largo, and there's crime happening in the building. And this little kid dresses up like Batman and is assuming Jim Gordon will help him with stuff. And Jim Gordon's like, I can't escape. And that was the whole idea of the story, was he can't escape Batman no matter where he goes. They're kind of intrinsically linked, and that inspires him to go back to Gotham and have this discussion with Batman and be like, I'm back, like. So Bob loved it. Batman appears in 3 pages, like actual Bruce Wayne Batman in a costume, the last 3 pages of the book. DC's like, we can't put out a Batman book with no Batman. It's like, well, there's a kid with Batman. And Shrek's like, the whole book's about Batman. Like, it's about it. And it's like, I think Paul Levitz was like, nope, and put it on a shelf. And they had paid me a painter rate to do an 80-page book or 64-page book or whatever it was. And it sat there and almost never came out. And then it came out. And they were going to do like a prestige format thing, and it just came out as a stapled book. They cut costs on it. But then it got nominated for a Harvey Award, and like pros found out about it, and like it critically got some love. And we felt a little more vindicated like after that. But it was this weird era of like, you should be like, all the editors that I knew were like, you should be doing mainstream content. Like you could, like you're smart enough to be doing the stories. Your art style is evocative enough. It's going to bring in new readers, but like, a lot of the people with money and a lot of the industry didn't know how to market any of that stuff. So I've always fallen into this gray area of, I don't know what to do with you. So it's like, I guess I just got to do it myself then and kind of do my own thing. And it just keeps validating the indie route.
Do you think that's part of what, you mentioned like your early book, it needed promotion. Do you think because you fall out of like their normal publicity machine, that's part of why you're conscious of that and think that way?
Yeah, I think so. Like
because that's another thing that's become the norm. Like you sort of have to, if you're an artist, if you're a cartoonist, whatever, like you have to sell your stuff now in a way that I'm not sure you used to have to do.
You have to be present. Even at a convention, you have to be at the table or people don't come up and buy your stuff. Like I would still have to be doing that thing where I'm actually sitting there drawing, and that will draw people to the table. If I'm not there, the books are there. If I'm there, the books start leaving and drawings start leaving. But you have to show up. You have to be present. And that's a lot of work. I mean, you guys know, like you got to be there, you got to participate and not rely on just the books to sell. I mean, it's nice when they do when sales are fairly good and they do find an audience. And ironically, Scholastic has been a really great home because I think the animation background, and I can do kind of all ages 4-quadrant kind of storytelling where it's kind of for everybody. Little kids get it. And young, medium-sized kids get it, like up through 12, 14. And you can show up in a classroom and they've all read it. Like, so the numbers, Scholastic's really interesting because they don't reflect how other books sell. People hear like, oh, comics sell 100,000 copies or whatever. It's like Scholastic numbers are, talk to Raina, like they're a different set of numbers through Scholastic because of the book orders, and it's different than even like mainstream publishing. Like, New York Times bestsellers sell a certain amount of books, and it's like Scholastic numbers dwarf that.
That's why there's no comic book New York Times bestseller list anymore because it would be all Raina.
It would be all Raina,
Yeah.
and kudos to her. I'm
totally.
super happy for Raina that that's happening, but it is because of the schools and the libraries, and that's what I'm starting to really see now is a younger audience kind of coming up that views what we do a little differently. So I feel like I'm in this weird transitional phase of being on the older end of the crowd that's still acceptable by the younger up and coming audience.
Imagine having comics in those like little tissue paper tear sheet things that they would pass out in the room class.
They're still in there.
That would be incredible. In 5th grade, the only comic that was in the Scholastic little, checkbox, put your $5 in the envelope and bring it to class the next day, I got Mouse in 5th grade. That was the only comic.
That's insane that you were able to get Mouse through that book, through that.
Insane.
But
in elementary school.
But it's honestly not insane. Now that I've got 2 kids, I've got a 10-year-old and a 14-year-old. And granted, they were kind of indoctrinated into comics from a very early age. I would read them Tales of Suspense, or, Tales to Astonish or Journey into a Mystery, like pre-Marvel short stories for bedtime, right? So they know who Kirby and Ditko are, like way early, and Stan Lee, all that. I think, and their friends, their crowd, now that I see the level of understanding that kids are at, and Brian Azzarello actually pointed this out at a convention once, and it has stuck with me. It's one of those things that you hear once and it's like, that's a nugget, and I got to remember that, is kids always want what their older brother or older sister have or understand. So if those older kids, those teenagers, understand a comic, the younger ones are going to find it and grab it, and they will work harder to understand what that story is about, and they will love it more because it's validated as I'm a little bit more of a grown-up. I'm not reading kid books. So I've carried that with me, even with the Scholastic stuff, where I don't like to pander to an age group. I like to write stories for everyone so that like a grandma can get it and maybe tear up or like it or laugh, and that's going to stoke a little kid to be like, what does grandma like? Can I watch? It's like a little kid getting away with watching a PG-13 movie or a rated R movie. It's like, I'm getting away with something. The adults like this. And I feel like if they had put more of that stuff that really is thought-provoking material, like Mouse,
right,
available for kids, we'd have kids like just skyrocketing off the charts with the kind of understanding and empathy and sort of storytelling that kids are capable of, that we don't give them credit for being capable of a lot of the time. I don't know. I wish more stuff was in those catalogs, is my point.
I feel like some of what you just described is when I think of Pixar. It's one of the things Pixar did from early on, where it was like everybody can enjoy this movie, which wasn't typical, especially of animated features when Pixar starts.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those Hollywood catchphrases where they call it and I dropped 4-quadrant earlier, right? And 4-quadrant is little kids, dating crowd, parents, and grandparents. And if you can tell a story that all of them want and will watch, you win, right? If you tell a Tarantino movie, you're going to get probably those two. Grandma and Grandpa don't care about Tarantino, but the date crowd does, and Mom and Dad think it's pretty great. But so you're losing half your audience potential. So I think where Pixar is really smart is they don't pander. They we try to tell stories. What Pixar's been really successful about, in my mind, is we try to task ourselves with telling stories we want to see, and we try not to dumb it down for anybody. Whether you're old or young, right? You make it universal. Because that's what you walk downstairs and, where I talk to you guys, it's universal. We talk about universal stuff. We're not targeting it. I mean, we are sometimes. We're talking about nerdy stuff. It's very niche, but real life isn't niche. It's like real life. So the stories can be real life too. So I definitely use that aesthetic for what I try to write. I try not to overdo it with language because, we'll use language, and my kids can handle language. They can handle innuendo, they can handle that stuff. But they also know that if I put that stuff in a book, or if we talk like that at home a little bit, it takes the wind out of it. And we just talk about, know your audience. Be respectful to the people around you. If it's going to offend somebody, don't talk like that. So I think that's that's where parenting comes in for me too, is as a storyteller, I feel like it's helping to just qualify the types of ways I tell stories so that a wider audience can enjoy them. It doesn't mean I have to tell stories they don't want to tell or pander. It's how I tell them. It can still be crazy concept, weird stuff, but anybody will get it if they sit and read it and try to immerse themselves in it.
You mentioned reading some of the pre-Marvel Universe, Ditko Kirby's
Yeah.
to your kids. I remember having this conversation with you years ago, and I find that really fascinating. Like, that's pretty cool. But I remember you telling a story about finding Kirby original monster art in a comic shop when you were young. Does that ring a bell?
I'm glad you remember that story. Yep. I still have some of the art I bought that day. So I worked at a movie theater, Century 22 movie theater next to in San Jose, next to the Winchester Mystery House. And not far from there was a comic shop. It's not there anymore. It's gone. But they had kind of a bad selection of comics, but then they had a glass case at the counter, and in it was 2 stacks of original art. Pages that Mignola had worked on from like World of Krypton and a bunch of other things that were $5 a page, and then a stack of Kirby Monster Comics pages for $10 a page.
What year is this?
This would have been 89, maybe, 90. And, I had $20 in my pocket. I'm not going to walk away with 2 pages. So I didn't buy any of the Kirby stuff. But I got some cool Mignola stuff. And I still have a couple of those pages at home. But that Mike would probably cringe at if I told him. But
it's good that you don't have those Kirby Monster pages because they didn't come from Kirby's hands. You
Nope.
know what I'm saying?
Nope.
That's
I don't know how that guy ended up with them. And it wasn't a stack. It was probably, 5 or 10 pages that he had there. And I think he was just trying to unload them. And it may not have even just all been Kirby, but they were probably from, somebody's collection or something that was probably stolen, or who knows where they ended up. I don't know. I have a Kirby page now that I traded some artwork for that it's getting back to the kids. And then I ended up with the Ditko page from a friend at work from Tales of Suspense #2 that's framed. So I had those at work, and I just changed offices, so I brought them home, and I let the kids fight over who got each one. So my older son chose the Ditko page. He's got that hanging in his room, and the younger one has the Kirby page. And a Walt Kelly strip
decoration
in his page. I know.
Scott, before we get into Pixar, in the 2000s, I don't know that we covered all the animation work. Were you because you're a man of two, you spin many plates.
There was a weird era in there where I finished at Cartoon Network, and I did a pilot for them that didn't go anywhere, but it was a good. It was a good lesson in directing really early on. I'm kind of playing with things. Mark Hamill did a voice for me, so I got to record some stuff with him, and got married at that exact same time. Pilot didn't get picked up, but I kept doing some freelance for Cartoon Network, but I decided I'm just going to do comics for a little while and freelance in animation and kind of drift a little. So that's when I was kind of finishing Soulwind out. And there was a guy who ironically used to work at Pixar on Toy Story 1 and 2 and Bug's Life, maybe. This guy, Reed Gershbein, I believe his name was. He had gotten some venture capitalist money and was going to start a Flash animation company, because that was the thing to do back then.
Yeah.
And wanted to turn some comics into some little animated things. So he had seen Volcanic Revolver, this Mafia book that I'd done for Oni, and he's like, let's do that. And so we optioned that. We made a trailer kind of for what the show would be, as we were trying to raise more money for that. So I was working in this Flash animation company trying to learn Flash and like how to produce that kind of stuff. We actually brought it to Comic-Con and premiered it, like showed stuff there and kind of had it running on a loop, and it drew a big crowd over to the booth, which was pretty cool. And we still get questions like, when is that coming out? And it's like, it's not. It fell apart. We didn't get the money to keep going. Volcanic Revolver was planned to be released in like 4-minute chunks, and then it would be enough 4-minute chunks to be like a movie, and we could put out the movie. But it was a good lesson in kind of indie animation, trying to get something going. So I wasn't working for a studio really at the time. I was doing a little bit of freelance here and there. And then the next big job that I ended up taking was Doug TenNapel had sold the show to Nickelodeon called Cat Scratch that was kind of loosely based on Gear, his comic Gear. And he's like, hey, I want you to come art direct it. I'm like, well, I have my own little studio that I'm sharing on Ventura with my buddy Brian. Do I have to be in-house? He's like, no, we'll get you an office here, but like you can do the stuff freelance if you want. So I was doing all the backgrounds, all the prop design, all the color design, like all of that stuff. And we were in the first season, we were about 4 episodes in, and then a buddy of mine, Mark Andrews, called me from Pixar. He was the story supervisor on Incredibles. He went on to direct Brave, and I worked with him on Brave and a bunch of other things. But he was like my big brother at CalArts. He was actually our officiant at our wedding. He was like, hey, we need board artists. You got to come up here. It's like, I'm not even really doing story most of the time. He's like, yeah, but you're comics. Like, just, you got to come up to Pixar, man. I'm like, I don't know. We're pregnant with our first kid. And like, this was 2004. He's like, you got to come up here. I'm like, dude, I'm in the middle of art directing a show. I'm going to leave them high. Like, I can't do that. He's like, I'm going to have Pete call you. I'm like, sure, whatever. He's like, Pete Doctor's going to call you. I'm like, uh-huh. So then 5 minutes later, Pete Doctor calls me. Hey, Mark said you should come up. And I'm like, I'd never really met Pete, maybe peripherally. I'm like, okay, I'll come up and we can interview or whatever. And I didn't know it at the time, but they were already apparently like, he's hired, let's just see if he's a jerk. And that's, you know, that's probably the best way to look at things is like, I already like their work. I know they can do the work. Do I want to work with them? And that was kind of the thing. So I went up and interviewed and it ended up being a good thing, and kind of looked at my wife and the kid, and Pixar was actually closer to where I grew up in Northern California, so it seemed like a good time to move, and I just haven't left there since then. So I moved up there, and then Brian, the guy that I shared a studio with, he interviewed and came up with me like a few months later, and so we both relocated and worked on a ton of stuff since I've been there.
See your name credits accelerate and get higher and higher on the Chiron or whatever the hell that credits piece is.
Yeah, the scroll. We call it the scroll.
Yeah.
So I started in story, but they knew that I did design work too, so I helped out on the end credits for Ratatouille. My buddy Nate Ragg was designing those, and Teddy Newton was doing a lot of the kind of running the animation on that. So I helped do a lot of the digital painting for that. The funny thing is when I got to work with them up there, I didn't know Photoshop. I assumed I'd be drawing on paper, and I showed up, you know, and was like, great. They're like, here's your desk, here's your computer. I'm like, where's the art supplies? They're like, I think there's some pencils by the photocopy machine. Crap, where the hell am I going to learn? So I learned Photoshop real quick, and learned to paint in Photoshop and all that stuff real quick. But worked on the end credits for that. And then WALL-E, I was doing story on WALL-E, and then designed the end credits for WALL-E. I was lead designer on those. And then helped out with a bunch of short films that were happening. Started working on the Cars stuff, Cars 2, Cars 3, Brave. I got pulled onto Brave to help on that. And I've just kind of bounced from thing to thing. And as you kind of work on these different things, like the shorts was a good opportunity. So I started co-directing and then directing some of the Cars short films. So that was really great because then I started learning more of the pipeline and directing actors, you know, more than I had at Cartoon Network and that kind of thing. So it was a good opportunity to kind of keep moving. And that's one of the things that I like about up there is they value people, you know, so we get a lot of that's the reason for coming in every day is I get to learn from people that are better than me at everything. Every artist that comes in there I consider better than me and try to always be learning, right? So again, that was like a thing that I learned from Maurice and everybody else was just stay humble, don't assume you're good. Assume there's something to learn from everybody with you, no matter how old they are, who they are, what they're doing, and don't be a jerk, you know. So that's kind of the aesthetic that I work under. But that covers I think the 2000s until now. Like, and even while I was at Pixar, like I'm still doing books. And that's when a lot of the Magic Pickle stuff for Scholastic has come out. Dugout just came out, but a lot of the stuff with Pixar, like all the ad house things. And then I'd started another little company called Red Window, and Pixar was distributing for me through there, and he would do all my design work. So a lot of my newer books I would kind of do through him.
And Trickster comes up in that time.
It does.
Time frame, I believe.
Yeah.
Because you must have had 5 free minutes, I guess, somewhere.
Well, me and some buddies at work had 5 free minutes.
I seem to remember, like, you guys would be a hit. Like, it would be like you and Mahfood at San Diego Comic-Con, just like this assembly line churn thing of just people coming and going and just art flying from your table. So that's San Diego Comic-Con, and then there's Trickster. Like, what happened?
So we were doing San Diego every year. Pretty much since I started doing Soulwind, I would go to San Diego every year because I was in LA and I could drive down.
Like you had your prime real estate. San Diego, you know, if you're coming back each year, you would get your same spot. And you and Mahfood had that great spot for years.
So that dates back to, I told you the first time I went to Comic-Con, I was brazen and I walked up to Alan Spiegel's table and met Jay Muth and Neil Gaiman was there at the time. So I met all these people at this table in like 93 or whatever. or 92. So then from then on, Alan remembered me every time I'd come up, and Alan's like, you know what? I talked to the guys. They all like you, Kent Williams and Dave McKean and Jay. Like we're all friends now. Like, if you need me to rep you, like if you need me to help you with deals, like I know the people at Scholastic. So Alan has been my lit rep since then. So Alan's table, if you ever went to my table at Comic-Con, was right next to where Jim and I would set up. And Alan would basically, we'd submit our applications together, and we would kind of carve out that area so that I knew Alan and all my like fine art friends were on one side of the wall, and then me and all my goofball friends like Jim and everybody were right there. We kind of owned that little island area. And then the prices of those tables just kept jumping and jumping and jumping. And some buddies and I at Pixar, because some of them would start doing books too, Ronnie Del Carmen and Enrico Casarosa, Ted Mathot, Bill Pressing, like they would come and they would kind of squat at our area too. And they would, if they were going to come to Comic-Con, we'd sell from that booth because it was a prime spot. And Mignola was right there, so we would always talk with Mike, and it was a good little area. And Mike is still there. He's still in that same spot. He and Steve Purcell, who's at Pixar. So like there's this kind of little incestuous group of comics, animation people in that spot. But we got to the point where it's like, this is a really expensive spot to sit, and we're killing ourselves making the money back, drawing and everything. Wouldn't it be great if there was a convention where you could just come and it was a party? It was like the party at the Hyatt, but like for the whole convention, and the pros didn't have to sit at a table. They could if they want. They can do drawings if they want, but this table, my thinking was like, is a wall between me and the fan, like me and anybody that likes my work, my audience. And the beautiful thing about comics is you can actually meet your audience, right? Like, and shake their hand. Like, and you want to, sometimes they become really good friends of yours. Like, you want to hang out with them and be able to have a better environment. So we started brainstorming, like, how do we get rid of the table? How do we do a convention and get rid of tables? And we're like, why don't we just throw a party? We should get a space right near Comic-Con and throw a party. And we'll set up, and we can do kind of what ProCon used to do, where we could do talks. And then we started getting lofty, and like, well, why don't we call them symposia, right? And symposia, if you look up the definition of a symposia, is a drinking festival where you would talk about philosophy and stuff. So we're like, well, we should serve drinks. So we ended up we found a wine bar right across the street from Comic-Con. And they had never done kind of an off-site thing like that. We had seen a couple things like that pop up. Nerdist didn't really exist yet. This was 2012, I think we did it. And we're like, well, let's see if we can get that wine bar. So we went and scouted a bunch of places, before Comic-Con, and we found this guy, and he's like, yeah, I'll rent it to you. We've never really done anything like that before, and the wine bar does events and stuff, so why don't you guys just take over the wine bar, and we'll open the bar during the event, and we'll make money off the liquor, and you can use the space, and why don't we just say 10 grand for the week? We were like, yeah, because the table is like more than half of that. So let's do that. So we did that, and then it's like, well, I know a bunch of pros. I'm just going to start emailing people and telling them I'm throwing a party and see if we can throw a party. So instantly everybody was like, that sounds awesome. And then they started telling their friends. And then Bernie Wrightson's like, I'll send you some artwork. And like people just started hopping on board. And then Scott Alley from Dark Horse calls, and Scott and I had worked together a little bit. And he's like, hey, Tom Morello's going to be down there from Rage Against the Machine. And he's like, he kind of wants to do, like, he's doing this Night Watchman thing. He kind of wants a place to play. And he's doing comics and stuff. Like, I'm like, yeah, let's do a concert too. So then I'm like, Mike Allred has a band. Mike, you want to? He's like, what? Yeah, I want to play. So like Mike's band comes out. And so then it's like, well, let's do life drawing too. And so we found a modeling service that came and would set up, and we're like, well, let's get someplace to donate supplies for the life. And we just had pads of paper and pencils out and free life drawing, or like $5 for life drawing. People would come and do their thing. And we were like, well, how are we going to make our money back off of this? Well, let's charge for the workshops, and we'll just design. I don't want to do panels. I want to do like a sit down, let's talk, let's drink, let's have somebody come around with drinks, and let's have it be conversational, and people can talk about whatever we want to talk about. So we designed a bunch of these different talks. It's like, well, how is everybody going to sell their work? And we're like, so we talked with my friend Anita, who was married to another buddy at work, Jeff Pigeon, and Anita really wanted to run a comic shop, and we're like, well, why don't we set up a shop within the shop, and then everybody can sell their work on consignment. That gets rid of the tables. So now pros can walk around and sell their work. We can set up signing times if they want to sit and sign. Like there were book launches, and it worked. Like the first year blew up, and we didn't realize how big it would blow up, and it did not go over well with Comic-Con International, and it did not go over well with the Hyatt, and it did not go over well with a lot of people because we hit right at the time when everybody was complaining about the media flux at Comic-Con. And they thought, and all the press ran with us, like, you know, flipping the bird to Comic-Con. And it's like, we're not. We want to play, basically we've been ghettoized. Artist Alley's in the very corner, and like everything else is, you know, Sony and Cartoon Network and whatever else. And it's like, we want a place that we can hang out and celebrate comics and people and the actual process of doing it. So we're just throwing a big party. But we stole all the traffic from the local bars at night, and you could hear us for blocks. You could hear that first Trickster for blocks. And it's because of the proximity of where it was at. It was literally across the street from Comic-Con. The next year we did a Trickster as well, but we had to look for a different spot because the owner of the wine bar was not the guy who cut the deal with us. Yeah, they changed hands off between seasons, and they wanted, I think, $25,000 a day for the next year. The year before, we spent $10,000 for the week. We're like, we can't afford that. We're doing this out of pocket. Like, it's literally out of pocket for us. We're not making money on this. So we moved to another area for the second year, and the third area, we just kept getting pushed farther and farther and farther out where it was affordable to do out of pocket. And so we stopped doing the party. But I think there's still value to something like that. It would be great to figure out how to do something like that where the pros can come and just not be pros and fans, but be like, this is comics community, and sure, that's so-and-so standing there, and I can go have a glass of wine with them or a little bit of a cocktail. Like, we had a different cocktail each night. We had, like, there were glasses that we sold with the Trickster logo. I mean, we tried to make it classy.
Yeah, I remember thinking it was a great idea because for all the reasons you say, you know, the Comic-Con was kind of, I don't know, about getting out of hand, but it was sort of changing and stuff, and it seemed like that was the welcome thing. But the execution was, like, such a high level, which is the piece you don't always see. Like, a lot of great ideas float around.
Yeah, I think it was because we announced we were going to build it, and then everybody decided they were going to come. Like, once like Mignola and a couple of other bigger names jumped on board. Like, I didn't know Dave Gibbons, and he emailed me. Like, people were emailing me out of nowhere going, hey, I want to be a part of this, I want to be a part of this. Mike Golden, like, got a hold of us, and like, I want to be a part of this. It's like, I don't even know how you fit into the, like, what do you want to do? He's like, well, I don't, you know, we try to figure things out. We just tried a bunch of things. We wanted to do an art show, so we got a hold of Criterion, right? And Criterion was like, Eric Skillman, the guy at Criterion, was like, yeah, we should try something, but why don't we get a hold of artists, and we can, like, let's get a hold of Toho, and we'll see if we can do like a Kurosawa themed show. And there were a lot of rights issues because of Toho and all that, but like, we got permission to have artists do original Kurosawa inspired paintings, and we did a little gallery show, and we just tried a bunch of things.
Benefit then? Was that like post the...
Yeah, it was after the tsunami. So we sent a bunch of the proceeds from that to tsunami relief.
And then did it become a regular space in San Francisco or something, Trickster? I remember there would be like calls for art.
So Anita was like, I'm going to open a brick and mortar, and I was like, I don't want a brick and mortar. She's like, but we'll do events and life drawing and all that. I'm like, great, that sounds awesome. So she did have a space for a while, and it was in kind of a really great area in Berkeley. But it was just off the beaten path enough that foot traffic was hard, and, you know, it suffered like all comic shops suffer. But it was nominated for, you know, Spirit of Retailing Award for the Eisners and all that good stuff. So we finally patched things up with Comic-Con, and, you know, I think we're all on good terms. But yeah, the store existed for a little while, and it would be great to have a place like that. But I think the spirit of Trickster, you know, our big plans were it would be like a pop-up, and we wouldn't tell people where the next one would be until like a few weeks ahead of time. And we had plans to like do South by Southwest or Telluride or a Book Expo America, and we would just like pop up across the street at all these events and kind of do this like drop-in.
It was punk rock, man.
Surprise thing, right?
It was super fun.
And we just never got it to that level. But that was the hope, that it would just show up in Japan, or it would show up in Tel Aviv, or it would show up wherever.
Can we talk about the Scholastic part of your career
before
we split? Yeah. So is the Goosebumps stuff the first?
Yeah, the Goosebumps thing was happening so I cut the deal with them or Alan did, actually, because he knew David Saylor, at Scholastic. David wanted to start the graphics line, like whatever it was, 15 years ago. And had seen Magic Pickle from Oni, and it had been out of print. And he's like, hey, why don't we do Magic Pickle? And maybe some chapter books or something too. So Alan and I were out at Mocha, I think in New York, and met with him, talked with him a little bit. And he was like, I don't know any of these other people. Like, how do we get a hold of Jeff Smith? How do we get a hold of these other people? And he ended up getting a hold of other folks to start publishing their books. And he knew he wanted to do all ages comics and was looking for that kind of material, but it hadn't really gelled into like a voice because it was still so new. But he formed the graphics label, and David's a fantastic guy. He art directed the original Harry Potter books. Like, he was, he's big time at Scholastic, and they started this whole new division for graphic novels. And everybody, all the publishing houses were starting those divisions at around that time. So he was kind of at the forefront of that. And that's how the Magic Pickle stuff kind of first hit and started coming out. Yeah.
Yeah. And where are we at now, man? Dugout.
And now, and then, so I had those kids, me and my wife, and I'm the third kid, unfortunately for my wife, because it's my job to never grow up, right? It's our job to never grow up. But I didn't play baseball really. I mean, I played a couple years of Little League, and I was horrible. But I had two boys, and it wouldn't have mattered if they were girls. It was like, hey, you got to do some kind of activity. What do you think? And with the first one, he was like, I want to try Little League. My friends are doing it. And it's like, okay, great. And then I ended up coaching for him. And then the second one saw the older one doing it, so he wanted to play Little League. And then they're playing two. Like, I had fear of missing out, and they each wanted me coaching. So I was either head coaching or assistant coaching for each of them. And I just coached my 11th team. So I was doing all this Little League stuff, and I had always had this idea of like baseball and zombies that I wanted to do, but it was more of a World War II thing, and it had to do with Nazi artifacts and raising the dead, and I knew that I wanted to do that. But then because I was exposed to Little League and these kids, I'm like, no, I think it's an all ages thing. I think that could be really fun to do zombies and ghosts and kids. So I pitched. I called David, and he's like, it sounds cool. What's send me pages. Like, we need to see 10 pages of it or whatever. I'm like, let me send you enough so that you see what the book's really about. He's like, just send me the first 10 pages. So we would talk for a couple of years about, and I'd be working on it. At the same time, I'm story supervising. I just finished directing some Cars shorts, and I was story supervising on Cars 3. So I had my day job that was taking up a lot of time, and I'm trying to get this comic out at the same time. So my output has dropped quite a bit because of work and family. But I'm working on it, and I wanted to get it to the point where the zombie shows up. And the zombie doesn't show up until page 70 or something. And I didn't want to show it to Scholastic until I had, it's like you're going to think it's a baseball comic, and it's not. It takes a huge twist, middle of the story. So finally I told David, I'm like, I have enough to send you, and I sent him 70 pages or whatever, and they sent it to marketing, and they're like, yeah, we love it. And they had some great comments. Originally I had it kind of narrated by the main character, and he's like, take out all the narration. I'm like, you're right. I haven't been doing comics in a while, and I super hate narration most of the time. I like the experience. Like movies, anytime I hear a narrator, it's like I kind of feel like you're phoning it in a little bit, and it's like I just don't. I want for me, I want it to be the experience of being in the moment in the story and learning with the characters rather than the characters telling you in hindsight, oh, and then wait and see what happened next, and kind of loading expectations. Like for me, a storyteller in comics, just like with film, like you're trying to craft an experience and trick an audience into feeling a certain way or reading it at a certain rate of speed. So that was a really great note from them to get me back to that. But that's kind of how Dugout came out of it.
Did you initially start visualizing it through Inktober illustrations? Like I remember.
No. So I started just doing baseball drawings. Yeah, I was just posting stuff on Twitter. And Jamie Rich and a bunch of other friends were like, and I would just say, I'm developing an idea. And I kind of loosely had the story. I didn't really have an ending yet. But I knew I wanted it to be about these twin sisters that didn't get along because I wanted to kind of do a parallel to my kids. And I wanted them to see girls can do that too. And, it doesn't matter who you are. You can have the same kind of adventures. And everybody goes through communicate. It's really about miscommunication, the whole story. If people just stopped to communicate, things would be a little easier. So I would do these drawings and just post them. And I'm doing the same thing right now with a new project that I'm toying with in my head. But I'm just starting to leak drawings here and there and just be like, is this something? Like, I don't know if this is something or not. And if it gets a reaction, it's like, I need this validation all the time for like, is this a story people want to hear? Okay, it is. it's such a weird story. I don't know. Maybe they do want to hear it. Maybe they don't. So yeah, it started out as like development stuff, but it wasn't quite Inktober. Inktober, I give myself different rules. The Sea Witch drawings that I've been doing with a ballpoint pen, I gave myself the rule of using. I was just coming back for the first Inktober. I was just coming back from Disneyland with my younger son. I split up the kids for the weekend, and I took one of them and gave my wife a weekend with the other one so that we can just break up the dynamic at home sometimes. And it was October 1st, we're on the plane ride home. It's like, oh, it's Inktober. We should do a drawing on the plane, but we don't have anything to draw on. All we have is a Disneyland hotel pen and coasters from like the Disneyland hotel that we brought home. Well, let's draw on these. And like, that's my rule. I'm just going to use this Disneyland hotel pen because it has ink in it. But my son was like, let's draw witches or sea witch. I'm like, okay, cool. And that became the theme.
So, Scott, I've talked to you in the past about this. You have like what feels like this amazing amount of creative energy, like a motor. I call it, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
And you've named like a lot of artists that you've kind of crossed paths with along the way. Working at Pixar, I assume that is stocked with other artists of this sort. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that creative energy that some people seem to have and others don't. And is that something you observe in other successful artists? Do you have any thoughts on how that comes about?
For me, I feel like it's breathing for me. I don't know where it comes from other than the need for validation. It's probably that thing where I feel like that's how I'm communicating with people. If I'm not generating something, I don't know what people think of me. And I feel like it's almost fishing for, not compliments, but fishing for a reaction from people. And I think any artist is that. It's a conversation, right? So it's just, I've started to notice more and more as I break down how characters work through how people really work, like what the masks people wear and how introverts and extroverts work. And you kind of see that like the people who don't put anything out but are these amazing artists, they're scared to have that conversation with people. They don't know, like it's like a diary and they don't want people to read it. And I've just been too stupid to not air my dirty laundry in front of people. I'll just show people anything I'm drawing. And I get reactions from people that way. And I feel like I have too many stories in my head that I just have to get out. So I feel like it is a little bit of a race against time. And, my dad recently passed away and I'm starting to get, I'm 45, I'm getting into that midlife, like, what am I doing? So I've got all these stories and I'm starting to realize like my arm hurts. Which ones do I want to waste my arm on? Like, what are the drawings that are valuable to me? But I still can't stop drawing. Like, I'm going to destroy my body before I stop drawing. I don't think I'll ever retire. People talk about retiring, and it's like, comics artists don't retire.
Yeah, that's some industrial revolution.
That's
bullshit.
Yeah, I mean, retirement sounds cool, but like my wife's like, you will go crazy if you think you're ever going to stop making anything. She's the most supportive person in the world. But I think it's been good for the kids. They see it, and I don't know that they'll be comics artists or anything, but they see that drive to like write or tell stories or get themselves out there, and then it's okay to do that.
Do you think some of that comes from, you described like a blue collar father and grandfather as mechanics, so you may not be like building motors.
Yeah.
But do you think that's influenced kind of your work ethic? And
yeah, I think so. They were constantly out in the garage working. They were constantly. And my dad was funny because he was like, I hate working on cars. They wouldn't teach me anything about cars. You're not going to be a mechanic. Like, you draw, you're going to hire somebody to work on your car. Like, he always figured like, don't be blue collar. And it's funny because artists are kind of blue collar. Like, I feel like we work our asses off. And people who don't draw, I don't think that. They think that it's a different thing. It's not white collar, it's not blue collar, it's, I don't know, rainbow collar or some other
mystical
no collar, something.
Non-artist, I think.
Yeah, but it's still closer to blue collar work a lot of the time. It's just you're focused. And I think that's the thing, is the focus. Like, being a mechanic is like a focus thing. So I think I did inherit that. I think musicians go through that, like, where you have to focus. My wife calls it going in your head. Like, you guys probably do it too, where you're just in a conversation and then you kind of like click off and zone out and like internalize all of a sudden. Everything around me is source material for a story or a character or something. So I'm constantly writing. And you guys are the same way. And you can't turn it off. And trying to communicate that to anybody who doesn't do that is difficult, but you get people who appreciate it and understand it. But maybe it is that drive. And I think being doing something with your hands, like being a mechanic or a chef or somebody who makes bread or what, that's Zen time. Like that's, you zone out and you love what you're doing. And the other irony, that I've discovered recently along those lines is my dad always, everybody always says, it's one of those tropes, love what you do. Oh, you must love what you do. Oh, you work at Pixar, that's so great. You must really love it. And it's like, it's still a job. What we do is still a job. And I've realized, yeah, I'm lucky. I think we're all lucky to have been driven. I don't know that we're lucky to do what we do because it's a lot of work. We've worked hard. So that's not luck necessarily. I think luck does play a role in how we get there. But I've started to look at it as I don't love what I do. I need to love what I'm doing in the moment. And if I don't love what I'm doing, it's not worth it. So if I'm working on something I don't love, it's not worth it. If I'm just doing freelance to pay the bills, that's a job now. It's not me loving what I do. I need to love what I'm doing. So Dugout, I loved what I was doing. Making books, I love what I'm doing. I don't always love what I'm doing at work, but I love what I work with and I love other aspects of it. But there's a fine line in there that I think is important, where you do need to love what you're doing at the time, or it's not going to be at a high level. That's why I appreciate you guys. It's obvious you love the stories you're making. You love the books you're putting out. You love the research. You love the making of it. And that's why they're art. That's why it's elevated material and it's not just stories for commerce. So hopefully I can keep there, be like you.
You got anything else, Jimmy? Well, Scott, I'm exhausted and need a nap just going through.
I know, dude.
This vast, giant career you've had, man. I wish you all the success in the world. I'm very happy to check out the new book, Dugout, from Scholastic.
Yeah.
I wish you all the success in the world. Hope you have double the output you have at this very moment, man.
God, well, I hope you guys keep making the books you're making so that my kids, my family, my friends have something to look at, because I don't trust everything out there, but I trust you guys to make good work.
You're going to have to keep my next one away from your shorties. Thanks again, man.
Cool.
Thanks,
Thank you, guys.